If you don't like Deicide, you don't like death metal. And if you don't know who Deicide is, let me lift that rock that's been over you for the past 40 years, you pink panty wearing poser. Deicide is one of the old school death metal bands hailing from the state of Florida here in the United States. Home of the Miami Dolphins, the Mar-a-Lago estate, and the legendary recording studio Moshpit with Scott Burns. Deicide started in the late 1980s, but under the name Amon, with their entire focus being on Satanism and anti-Christianity. Unlike some of their peers who were writing about horror movies and serial killers. Amon featured OG members Glenn Benton on bass and vocals, as well as Steve Ashim on drums. Amon would also have the renowned Hoffman Brothers, Brian and Eric, on electric guitars. Amon would record and release 2 demos titled Feasting the Beast and Sacrificial, but due to copyright issues with King Diamond's song Amon Belongs to Them off his concept record Conspiracy, Amon was forced to change their name, and so they settled for the name Deicide, which stands for the killing of God, which is fitting for a death metal band that is branded as being heavily satanic. The Amon demos would be re-released sometime later in a compilation record and would be included in the box set that I will be showing you in today's video. We also had the Amon picture disc already before getting the box set, and I personally prefer the original artwork over the re-release. I will also mention that all of the vinyls that come in this box set are a kind of transparent red. Most of the songs off these first 2 Amon demos were re-recorded for Deicide's debut studio album, Deicide. This would include bangers such as Dead by Dawn, Sacrificial Suicide, and Oblivious to Evil, which was changed from Oblivious to Nothing off the Feasting the Beast demo from 1987. Both this debut album and Deicide's sophomore album, Legion, would be produced by legendary metal producer Scott Burns. These records are cemented in death metal history as being some of the most brutal projects that jump-started the genre. Both of these albums would be released under RC Records, otherwise known as Road Racer Records. This was Roadrunner Records' original name in the early 80s before settling on their current name. Glenn Benton was decent friends with various members of Cannibal Corpse during these early years in the 1990s, as Chris Barnes and company would fly from New York and begin recording some of their earliest albums at Moshpit Studios with Scott Burns. Glenn sat in on a few early recording sessions for Cannibal Corpse and shared guitarist Jack Owen, who not only band hopped from Cannibal to Deicide, but would eventually settle in Chris Barnes' current project, 6 Feet Under, which is where he resides today. I'm sure I don't have to explain how brutal and heavy Deicide's first 2 albums are. If there's one word I could use to describe old Deicide's sound, it would be evil. I think Glenn Benton's layered vocal style, the mix of the highs and the lows, is my favorite element as it is so demonic and ghoulish. It feels as though we are listening to the lost souls of people stuck in hell, and I think that's exactly what Glenn is going for. I also have to admit that the Hoffman Brothers sound pretty great here too. For how strong these albums are, I'm going to put them both in the fetch tier, as I would rate them both a 9 out of 10. So who is Glenn Benton? Glenn Benton is just a regular dude who happens to have an inverted cross branded into his forehead. This first happened when Glenn was just 22 years old, and since becoming a father, Glenn has mentioned that it was probably not a smart idea, but oh well. Growing up in a Catholic household, rebelling against the powers that be has always been Glenn's MO, saying he was always known as the evil little bastard in his family. Glenn has also commented on his satanic songwriting, saying that if fans try hard enough, there's little messages here and there between the lyrics that they can find. Glenn even stated in an interview once that when he played some of Deicide's songs backwards, there's unintentional messages that have come to light that even he said scared the shit out of him. During these early years of Deicide, Glenn and his band couldn't help but stir the pot just by existing. I mean, when you have a band name such as Deicide, you're bound to piss off one or more Christians. By the time Deicide released their 3rd studio album, Once Upon the Cross, in 1995, the band had already faced multiple bomb threats at their shows, censorship of their music, and promotion companies refusing to work with them for being, quote, too satanic. On top of that, they dealt with protests from both Christians and animal activists alike. Now, we know why the Christians were unhappy, but why the vegans? I mean, we know that vegans are the most kind-hearted and peaceful individuals on this planet that would never try and shove their veganism into your face and make you feel like a guilty abuser for shoving that burger into your fat face right now, right? Of course not. Well, if it wasn't for Deicide performing a show with literal rotting meat on stage, it might be for Glenn murking a squirrel with a pellet gun during an interview in his attic in 1993. Once Upon the Cross would be the first album under the new, but not new, record label Roadrunner Records, who had officially changed their name at this time. This third album, in my opinion, is all killer, no filler, just like the first two. So, Once Upon the Cross, you will be joining Deicide and Legion in the fetch tier. In 1997, Serpents of the Light would be released on Roadrunner and would feature a very blue in the face Jesus. I still don't know how I feel about this artwork. Like, I think it works, but it also doesn't. Is that just me? Overall, the music on this fourth installment is not as strong as the previous three. I think it's because this album features more of a cleaner production style, but it's still pretty good for Deicide. And for that, I'm putting this just below the others in Yas Queen Slay, as I would rate it about an 8 out of 10. Both Once Upon the Cross and Serpents of the Light would be recorded at Morrisound Studios, with Scott Burns, of course, producing and mixing it. The Light would be the last Deicide album that Scott Burns would touch, but not the last time that Deicide would record at Morrisound Studios. Unlike Cannibal Corpse, who went down to Texas to record some of their later 90s, early 2000s records after Scott Burns retired, Deicide would continue to record tracks at Morrisound with all of the original band members. In the year 2000, Incinerate Him would be released into the world, also with a questionably boring album cover. Sorry, Glenn. This record would feature Bible Bashers, which is arguably one of Deicide's most popular songs in their entire catalog. They would also have their track The Gift That Keeps On Giving being featured in an episode of The Sopranos, which I had no idea about until I read it on Metal Archives, but even though it's been a few years since I binge watched the show, does that not feel like a really weird cameo to anybody else? I will also mention that The Gift That Keeps On Giving is probably one of the worst songs in Deicide's catalog, in my opinion. This record was absolutely rough pickings, and you can definitely hear the drop in quality. I would put this in doorstop tier, as I would give it a 5.5 out of 10. Next in line, we have arguably one of the worst albums in Deicide's discography, at least based on most of the reviewers, and that is In Torment and Hell. I mean, this literally has a 34% on Metal Archives right now, with the band stating that Roadrunner rushed them to finish the record, which is why the album art and sound quality are, quote, not very good. But this is going to be a wildly unpopular opinion, but In Torment and Hell is a hidden gem. I absolutely loved this album. Now, it didn't really start to click with me until about the fourth song or so, but there are some absolute bangers, such as Vengeance Will Be Mine and Worry in the House of Thieves. And I personally did not notice any bad sound quality, or at least it did not take away from the musical experience for me. This is a banger album, and so it goes in Yas Queen Slay tier. And Torment in Hell would be the last album under Roadrunner Records. After this, Deicide would begin their label hopping adventure, signing with Earache to release their 7th studio album, Scars of the Crucifix, in 2004. Scars is an interesting album because Glenn mentioned in an interview that him and Steve were left to do most of the songwriting at this point, and that the Hoffman Brothers were just kind of going through the motions of the songwriting and recording process. However, if that was the case, I personally couldn't tell based on their playing. In Torment in Hell was groovier and slower, and this record is filled with aggression, blast beats, and it's unrelenting. I felt like Scars of the Crucifix was an amazingly brutal and heavy return with a more balanced and punchier production, great riffage from the Hoffman Brothers, and even a piano instrumental, which in my opinion was a huge change of pace for the band that I absolutely loved. This is also the first album that I began to notice a track list pattern that Deicide had started, in which the band would put the title track of the album as their first song to introduce you to the record. They have since stopped doing this on their last few records, but they did keep up this trend for several albums, and in my opinion, I think that they should bring it back because it was oddly satisfying as a listener, reading the liner notes and everything. So Glenn, if you're watching this, which you're probably not, but I would love if you could bring back that trend. It was super satisfying to look at, and I really enjoyed it. I put Scars of the Crucifix in Yas Queen Slay tier, as I would give it an 8 out of 10. The 2 years between Deicide's 7th and 8th studio albums would be quite stressful for our poor satanic overlords, Glenn Benton and Steve Ashim, as they would begin going through a legal battle with the Hoffman Brothers over songwriting credits and payment. Glenn mentioned in an interview with Decibel magazine how the Hoffman Brothers were extremely dissatisfied and surprised by their publishing checks from Earache after the release of Scars of the Crucifix. The Hoffman Brothers argued that they deserved more money as they helped equally with the songwriting process, which Glenn refused to do so, stating that they only get paid for the songs they individually write. This would cause the Hoffman Brothers to quit Deicide and begin causing drama for Glenn and Steve, going as far as to threaten Steve at his house and spread rumors about Glenn and his character. Glenn stated in an interview that originally when Deicide began, the band was splitting everything equally 4 ways, because at the time, everyone was pitching in equally for songwriting, both lyrically and instrumentally. Over the years, however, things had drastically changed, which caused Glenn and Steve to rethink how to split the money under their new label contract with Earache. Eventually, Glenn and Steve sued the Hoffman Brothers for slander, as well as countersuing them for the rights on the band's name. Glenn stated, "They can't do a thing to me, dude. I own the name. They went behind my back and filed on my trademark, so I'm in the process of suing them to get their names off it, and I will win. They abandoned their jobs, and now they want to come back. Well, there's no coming back, man. Sorry. It's a better band now because they're gone. They're just a couple of losers, and they rode on me and Steve's coattails for years." After the falling out with the Hoffman Brothers, Deicide would release their 8th studio album, The Stench of Redemption, which would be the first record featuring ex-Cannibal Corpse guitarist Jack Owen, as well as Ralph Santoya. The Stench of Redemption was quite a melodic piece of work for Deicide, and it was welcoming on the ears in my opinion. I felt like Jack Owen was really able to experiment a bit with his playing, considering a lack of inspiration and a need for change were his main reasonings for leaving Cannibal Corpse to begin with. This 8th studio album would also be Deicide's longest record to date at the time, coming in at 38 minutes. I thought this album was pretty good, so I would put it in the worth buying tier, as I would give it a 7 out of 10. Next to be released is Till Death Do Us Part, otherwise known as the Divorce album, which came out in 2008 on Earache Records. I absolutely love the album cover for this record, but I have to say this album is quite rough when we dive into the music. My favorite tracks were the first 2 and the last 2, which is kind of funny because half of those songs are instrumentals that open and close the album. Before this record was released, Glenn Benton was actually going through a really nasty divorce, which also resulted in a custody battle over his 2 sons. Because the courts had to decide which parent was better suited for taking over custody, Glenn had to put Deicide on a hiatus so that he could prove to the judge that just because Deicide was a satanic death metal band that he sang in did not mean that he couldn't be a good parent for his kids. Along with the stress of the custody battle, feelings of lost love, trust, and bitterness towards his ex-wife during this ordeal are evident in the lyrics and overall vibe of this entire record. Marriage, betrayal, and heartbreak are massive themes within the songwriting, including songs such as Till Death Do Us Part and Not As Long As We Both Shall Live. Till Death Do Us Part leaves much to be desired, as it is quite a safe, predictable album from Deicide, and it also has a longer runtime too than any of their previous records, coming in at 42 minutes long. For that reason, I give it a 5 out of 10 and would put it in the doorstop tier. In 2011, Deicide would release To Hell With God, which would be released on Century Media Records this time. It seems Glenn Benton was able to heal from his divorce and come back to bring a relatively heavy 10th studio album. My biggest complaint with this album and the next to come is the lack of layered, ghoulish vocals that Glenn is so famous for. Without those layered vocals, Glenn just sounds like Corpse Grinder, which is to say, it makes his voice null and void. This album was okay, and I'd put it in worth buying tier. There was a falling out between guitarist Ralph Santoya and Glenn Benton from the time of this album's release and their 11th studio album, in which Ralph quit Deicide for undisclosed reasons. Glenn Benton went on to state that Ralph Santoya was unprofessional and genuinely disliked the guy. Deicide would then feature Kevin Quirion on lead guitar, which brings us to the release of their 2013 studio album, In the Minds of Evil, which is easily one of my favorite Deicide albums and one of my favorite album covers in their catalog. In the Minds of Evil is stronger in terms of heaviness, and it feels fresher than their previous 2011 release. The production is good too, and brings it back to that old school death metal sound with modern production. The latter half of the album absolutely slaps, even though there is a severe lack of layered Glenn vocals. I can make an exception due to how awesome the instrumentals sound to me on this record. I would put this album and their next record from 2018, Overtures of Blasphemy, in the Yas Queen Slay tier, as they're both strong later career albums. On this 12th studio release, Jack Owen is no longer featured on it, having left Deicide to join Chris Barnes's project 6 Feet Under. Now, look, I support you, Jack Owen, I really do, but why did you have to leave Deicide to record Nightmares of the Decomposed, which is easily one of 6 Feet Under's worst albums to date? Filling in for Jack Owen would be Mark English, who was in Monstrosity for some time, and for those who do not know, Monstrosity was the first band that George Fisher was a part of before joining Cannibal Corpse. A few months before the release of Overtures of Blasphemy, Ralph Santoya would unfortunately pass away due to a heart attack. This brings us to Deicide's most recent release, their 2024 album, Banished by Sin, which if you watched my best and worst albums of 2024 list video, you would know that I gave this record a 9 out of 10, and it was my number 2 album of 2024. This album would also be released on a different label, that being Reigning Phoenix Records, and would feature Taylor Nordberg on electric guitar, replacing Mark English. I would put this album in the Fetch tier because, along with it having amazing, strong instrumentals reflective of their previous 2 albums, Glenn Benton brought his layered, demonic, and ghoulish vocals back, which heightens the listening experience for me. I absolutely love this album, and I think it's a very strong record in their discography, regardless of what some people might say. The only big complaint I have on this album is the AI art that was used. It would not have been difficult at all, in my opinion, for Glenn to hire a real artist to draw or paint him something similar, and I think it would have looked honestly much cooler, especially with how people feel about AI art in the metal community right now. Like, I think it's just better to hire real artists and support them during this time. We want to keep metal music alive. We want to keep metal music authentic and not let it be infiltrated by artificial intelligence. The same should be applied for real artists who work very hard to design and create the metal album covers that we know and love today, whether it's digitally or with some sort of physical mixed media. Here's my final ranking on all of their albums, with Deicide, Legion, and Banished by Sin being in the highest tier. That is so Fetch. And unfortunately, our doorstops are going to be Incinerate Him and Till Death Do Us Part. And that's going to do it for my Deicide deep dive. If you made it this far in the video, let me know down below in the comments, what are your top 5 Deicide albums? What's their worst in your opinion, and what's their best? Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to see more exclusive content from me, make sure to go head over to my Patreon, and you can see a ton of things like full Twitch reactions, 5-song discography dives, and a series I'm doing reacting to and watching Metalocalypse for the very first time. So I'll have links to social media, Patreon, and all of that down below. You can also become a channel member here on YouTube and see exclusive content that way if you'd like. I appreciate you being here, and I will see you in the next deep dive. Bye, you guys.